I got to see the contest up close and personal when we were essentially debating whether or not we were going to try to assassinate, and I use that term carefully, Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan with a Predator drone that was overflying him and surveilling him, or at least we had good evidence to believe it was him. We were 70–80% certain. We couldn't do it because at that point we had not armed the Predator. Once 9/11 occurred, we went hell-bent to arm Predator and even develop other drones that could be lethal. It's a technology that can be used. Technologies that can be used will be used more often than not. But it's here with us right now, and we need the rules, we need the regulations, we need the precedents, we need the protocols, we need the international and domestic law, and we need the practice that goes along with what we anticipate being the future.
We hadn't used them in the armed and the lethal capacity until after the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And the reason for that were Israel showed proof of concept, so showed that it really was possible to be militarily useful. So the U.S. has used them in the so-called War on Terror, both within Afghanistan, to reach remote areas that the U.S. otherwise would not be able to project military force. That's where it began. And the U.S. took existing technologies. So they took Predator and Reaper drone planes that were used for intelligence and surveillance and armed them with off-the-shelf missile technology that they had. So they basically paired Hellfire missiles to Reaper and Predator drones. And that's the lethal drone technology that the U.S. has today. Other countries have different variants of that technology, but they are basically taking off-the-shelf technology for remotely piloted intelligence and surveillance vehicles and putting different missile technology on them. So the U.S. has used them primarily in the war zones in Afghanistan, and then also has used them outside of war zones. And this is perhaps the area that's most troubling when we look at both the moral and the legal concerns, has used them outside of war zones in Somalia, in Libya, in Yemen, in Pakistan, and other places. So civilian deaths are very controversial. The proponents of drones say that these technologies, using lethal technologies on these remotely piloted vehicles, that it is more humane and more able to discriminate and to decrease civilian deaths. But that's very controversial because there's not a lot of transparency and accountability about the number of these strikes, and there's also great controversy about how you count civilian deaths.
There is no one answer to how many civilian casualties the drone war has created, especially under Trump. President Trump has made the drone war even more opaque. So right now, our best guess, outside groups put the number anywhere between 6,000 to 25,000 civilians killed in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. admits to 1,061 of those. Over half of them have been since Trump was elected.
The numbers are difficult to ascertain, again, because the government doesn't release them. We did see what looked like almost a doubling of the use of armed drones by the Trump administration in its first year. Yet in the second year of its administration in Yemen, for example, we've seen a drastic cut in targeted killings, perhaps because of the U.S. involvement in the other conflict in Yemen with the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis. But nevertheless, there's been a drop. We have seen a reported drop in the number of drone strikes in Pakistan, but since those have never been publicly acknowledged by the government, it's very difficult to tell. We do have what we think is a reported increase of the use of drones, particularly by the CIA in Afghanistan, and a reported change in the rules for when the CIA can use drones. But again, none of that's been disclosed to the public, so it's very difficult to get the real details.
On multiple occasions, they have said that a particular strike had caused 0 civilian deaths, and then independent reporting showed that there were people killed in the strike, like children who were clearly non-combatants, and the Pentagon has then revised their numbers upward. So they have a tendency to to guess that anytime they don't know someone is a civilian, that they're probably not a civilian when they've been in a strike. Further, the CAA doesn't report civilian deaths or its strikes at all, and so deaths from CAA drone strikes are, completely unreported.
There have been many reports from people who were part of the program, from whistleblowers, those who participated in the program, that one of the main ways in which folks are targeted are through targeting their suspicious activities, and not through targeting a named personality strike, a named person, but through what's called signature strikes. So doing reconnaissance and saying, look, does this activity that we're seeing add up to what we think is suspicious behavior? Therefore, we think this is a military combatant who we could legally and morally strike. More than half, so the majority of these strikes have been against signature strikes, those folks that we don't name, we don't have a particular person in mind, but by the behavior, it seemed to be suspicious. The Obama administration is counting almost all of that as actual combatants.
How do we get drone news now, the attack of these drones? Radio, TV, internet, you name it. It's headline news in this part of the world. And even though sometimes I think when the news, you run news in some parts of North America or Europe, it says, a serious threat to citizens in Europe or America was taken out. But they don't mention the innocent children, the trauma, the houses destroyed, and what effect that has left. They really have been not serious analysis. I don't have scientific data, but we are seeing since 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, drones, troops, billions of dollars spent, training of new governments, training of new armies and soldiers on these new nation-building adventures and experiments. And is my region, my community, my country safer? Absolutely not. I think the insecurity, the level of insecurity, not just in our part of the world, but I think around the globe, has increased.
Precedents being set by our use of UAVs are very frightening to contemplate. There is not a single technology of warfare in the history of warfare which hasn't been adopted and used by others and ultimately used against the hegemon itself. Whether that hegemon be Rome, Assyria, Britain, or whatever empire has used it in the past. It will happen. We will have it used against us. That's why it's so dangerous to be setting these precedents of, for example, flying across borders with countries with whom you're not at war and killing people. What's to stop China from doing the same thing? What's to stop Russia from doing the same thing? And the proliferation of these UAVs around the world is also frightening. Let's look at how Russia got its most competent UAVs, including lethal ones. They bought them from Israel. This is easily doable. If you got the money, you can buy them.
The number of countries that have lethal drone technologies is increasing every day. The low number is 50. Others are saying we're up to about 75 or 80 today. Many countries have drone technology for lots of purposes, for border control, for environmental purposes, for intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, for humanitarian purposes. But then arming those drones, kind of going along the path that the United States did, taking the technology that they had developed for other purposes and giving them the lethal armed technology, more and more countries are passing that threshold. So probably by the time this video is produced, the number will be even greater.
We know that there are 12 countries that have used drones in combat. But that being said, I think we can take for granted at this point that virtually every country has some level of drone capability. Drones are, of course, commercially available off the shelf, and while we think of those as peaceful or even toys, the reality is those have been weaponized by a number of countries and by non-state actors, including ISIS. You can attach a bomb to some of those and then fly them into people, and they've been used to kill people that way.
So they're very easy to buy, to purchase in the marketplace, or to develop, to add on munitions to your existing drone technology. So there's really no upper limit on that. And of course, the big concern is what are the numbers of non-state actors that have lethal drones. We know that all the 4 types of non-state actors, so terrorist groups and international criminal cartels, the illegal non-state actors, and non-governmental actors and multinational corporations, the legal non-state actors. We know that all 4 of these types of non-state actors have drones and are using drones in their business operations. So humanitarian groups use them for surveillance. The United Nations uses them to try to record war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, to track refugee flows. So there's lots of humanitarian uses for these remotely piloted vehicles. The commercial zone, Google, Amazon, they all want same-day delivery, so they are all in on developing drone technology for commercial purposes. Drug lords are already using drones to deliver their drug contraband, so international criminal cartels are already using them. We do need to develop new international law as well as new domestic law governing the use of drones. We need that for non-lethal drones because we're expanding the use of these new technologies across commercial sectors, humanitarian sectors, across all of these venues, law enforcement. So we need and are trying to scramble to keep up with the technology to develop new laws for how these drones will be used for legal, commercial, and humanitarian law enforcement purposes. The same is true of drones' use in lethal warfare contexts. Some would argue for a total ban on drones. Others would argue for a limitation on the use of drones. Either of those are really important ways to go. You could argue for a total ban because the ways they have been currently used have been violating both law and moral constraints. Or you could argue that at least there should be a radically curtailed and limited use of drones and put some new laws in place that would govern that. Either one of those paths would be better than what we have now, which is really the Wild West. Here's why the U.S., as the leader in the use of lethal drones, needs to become a leader in law, in international law and domestic law governing the use of drones. Right now, the proponents of drones have been looking at it as this is only in the U.S. interest to expand the use of these new technologies, thinking that only the United States could use these technologies for our political, military, or even economic gain. Other actors can use these technologies against us. And if we want to limit the violence that could be done against us by these new technologies, we need to very seriously think about what these laws curtailing the use of lethal drones should be, and we need to be at the forefront of advancing new legal safeguards regarding the use of drones.
There's increasing data and information about how conflicts can be resolved nonviolently, and so I think thinking about how do we incorporate that knowledge into and that practice into what our public policies are is something that we believe is an essential way for us to address violent conflict and to avert the use of lethal drones as what some people may see as a solution. In fact, it is not a solution. It is exacerbating extremist behavior, we believe.
So our understanding is that under the Obama administration, the president did have to sign off on every targeted killing, and that President Trump decided to lower the level of authority for those strikes. So commanders in the field could be making those decisions. Now, in some respects, that sort of makes sense if you're actually in an armed conflict. Battlefield commanders can make decisions. But in so many cases, we saw targeted killings take place outside of what most people would understand to be an armed conflict. And again, commanders on the ground are facing a great deal of pressure from their troops, from the environment that they're operating in, and they may not be best placed to make these decisions.
I think that the drone program, just like any other national security program, should reflect democratic consent for a policy like that, especially a policy that is so consequential. And the secrecy that surrounds the drone campaign means that there's a disconnect between what Americans know and what the government's actually doing. And, you know, I think that there are programs, national security programs, that the government is able to carry out only because of secrecy. That was true of the interrogation programs under the Bush administration. And even with the drone campaign under the Obama administration, at the beginning of the Obama administration, almost nothing was public about drone strikes overseas. And then over time, largely as a result of litigation, the Obama administration released a little more information. More information got out from journalists who were able to visit Yemen and Somalia. And when more information got out, the government was forced to change its policies. And it narrowed the policies, at least at the margins. In May of 2013, the Obama administration imposed presidential policy guidance that was intended to narrow the drone campaign in some respects, regularize it, make sure that civilian casualties were, or at least make an effort to minimize civilian casualties. And, you know, I don't think those changes were sufficient, but those changes were made possible by transparency.
One of the characteristics of this type of warfare is that the drone operators are not at risk.
Yes.
They're not in a kill or be killed situation. They're an eye in the sky operating in physical safety thousands of miles from the battlefield. So this creates a situation that we could call a moral hazard.
Yes, very much so.
If I don't have any skin in the game, it can lower the threshold for the use of lethal force. There's no risk of American blood being shed in most cases, unless there's boots on the ground, U.S. troops on the ground.
This is not traditional war. This is, you know, you're 10,000 miles away, you're totally immune from any counterattack or any measures to be used against you, and you're watching people, often for a period of time, who are at a funeral, who are at a party, who are walking down a street, who are coming out of a house, or whatever, and suddenly all the criteria come together, as it were, and you're told to pull the trigger. And you not only watch the Hellfire strike and you watch the explosion, but oftentimes you monitor the aftermath. The person crawling away with his leg missing, the woman bleeding to death on the alley as you watch, and so forth. This is a different kind of warfare, and frankly, I wouldn't have anything to do with this kind of warfare.
The Talmud says broadly, someone that gets up, if someone is going to kill you, you can get up earlier and kill him. Okay, it's kind of it's a Talmudic phrase. For instance, it's usually referring to individuals in that sense, because ultimately in our Jewish tradition, every life is precious. Every life is created in the image of God. Everyone has a certain holiness about him, and so to say that one life is more valuable than another life is deeply offensive to Jewish values.
It's secret, it's extra-legal, it separates the citizens of this country, including we evangelicals, from our own leaders, because we don't know what's going on, and only occasionally we hear about it when there are civilian casualties, which is inherent in drone warfare. Civilian deaths.
Armed drones are expanding warfare. Empirically, we know this to be true. The United States is using lethal drones in places where we are not at war, like Somalia, Libya, Yemen, Pakistan, and in places where we otherwise would not be engaged in violence. Lethal drones are being used outside of war zones, and that expands the killing fields to places where we would otherwise not send boots on the ground. There is zero chance that the U.S. President or the U.S. Congress would authorize sending in troops on the ground to invade Pakistan, to engage in boots on the ground in Somalia, in Yemen, in Libya. But having the ability to send remotely piloted vehicles to those areas to drop Hellfire missiles without putting our own U.S. soldiers in harm's way is what makes possible expansion of warfare to those geographic areas.
What we're told about drones being discriminate, in fact, there are a great number of innocent people who are killed. When I was serving in Afghanistan as a chaplain, there was an operation called Haymaker that involved primarily targeting what the military called high-value targets with drones. And by the military's own analysis, 219 people were killed in Operation Haymaker, and only 35 of them were the intended targets. So 9 out of the 10 people killed were not the intended targets. So that's just one example of how this type of warfare does not meet the criteria of discrimination.
So it's not the drone itself, it's the humans who are making decisions to use those drones. Now you can use a drone during war, and it could be very legitimate. And other places, drones are being used to literally, you're like a carte blanche license to assassinate an individual who's perceived to be a terrorist threat or a threat in general, and that too in someone else's sovereign country. And I think that is the moral dilemma people are discussing and saying, well, if the roles are reversed and if someone else from some other foreign country struck an American in America with a drone, how would we feel?
I think for Friends, there are several levels of concern about the use of lethal drones. One is that it is a form of extrajudicial killing, that it's not clear who is making the decision about who will be a target of lethal drones. Another is that despite what the administration and what we've heard is the best effort to have precise targeting, there are civilian casualties that have been much more than, we don't even know for sure how many, because we don't get accurate reports of what's happened, but the civilian casualties is a big issue. I think the third level of concern for us is the kind of existential threat that exists when drones are circling overhead. We've certainly heard reports from Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia and other places where the United States has had lethal drones, that just the existence of these drones provides a kind of stress that is hard to imagine living with. And then there's the concern for the use of, the concern about the people who are actually operating the drones, and that there is a remote kind of killing to what they're doing that is problematic.
I've heard people say the impact that it's had on them personally and psychologically. I think one of the things that we don't hear in the United States enough is the impact that war has on people who are actually doing the fighting. We don't hear enough about the impact that war has on families.
If the purpose is security and using drones gets rid of one person that may in fact be some way related to terrorism, does that actually create greater security? And for me, as someone from a peace church, that sort of question is, I would say, is quite uncomfortable.
I mean, we have been watching and reading the reports of different agencies. It has never been one single person who has been killed along with him or along with her. You have many other people who are unintentionally targets of death and destruction. So on the one hand, it is theologically, it violates that. The whole idea of targeting extremists is a wonderful idea, but the problem is that it does not kill that ideology, that subversive interpretation of Islam. Third is, it generates so much of mistrust and so much of distrust about America itself. When you have seen that, particularly in Pakistan or in Yemen, it has generated so much of ill will and hate against America.
We as a society need to grapple with the moral distancing effect that drones have created. They've made it very easy for our country to choose the use of force to respond to any perceived threat, as opposed to diplomacy, development, or any other option. And we've ended up now in our longest war. We're almost 2 decades into this war. Just sort of stumbling into that because drones have reduced the cost to us of going to war. And so that has become our permanent means of dealing with terrorism. But the problem with that is that we could end up 2, 4, 6 decades from now using the same means, still killing people with drone strikes, and still ultimately creating more terrorists by devastating the communities that they come from, and further radicalizing, people in the area.
Most egregiously, some people are targeted simply because of where they are and how old they are. In areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, any male between the ages of 20 and 40 who are found in certain areas and who are killed by a drone strike are automatically labeled combatants. I think in one case there was a cleric who was trying to educate an extremist on how his actions were against the tenets of Islam. Nonetheless, these people were killed.
One of the things that's happened in the United States especially is that the line about warfare used to be quite clear. When the Congress declared war, we were at war. When it didn't declare, we weren't. But now, Congress has not declared war for years, and yet we've been engaged in warfare all over the place. Drones are used in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Mali, Gaza, Iraq, Syria, the list goes on. Almost 100% of the victims and targets are Muslims.
The technology is a temptation to see there can be a simple, easy, and cheap way to police our communities or to police the world. That's a fantasy. That's a myth. What these technologies, and we've had them now for quite a while, what they cause is blowback. What they cause is increased terrorism. What they cause is a breakdown in community relations. They break down civil rights. And finally, they do not solve problems. They are themselves part of the problem.
A song of peace for lands afar and mine. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my holy shrine. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too and clover, and skies are everywhere.